Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Soul on the Slab. Is there no limit to what neuroscience can do? One of our keynote controversies here at the Battle of Ideas. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas. I suppose it's a testament to the PAT programme that we are clashing with the science strand next door. Actually, the issue of neuroscience has moved well and truly out of the sphere of science and is discussed by many people in public policy, and that's one of the things we want to reflect on. And there isn't too much in the way of human activity today that isn't now fashionably explained supposedly by neuroscience. I used to my speakers an example of Paul Zach's recent book, The Moral Molecule, that explains that a hormone involved in neural transmission, quote, is in fact the key to moral behaviour, not just in our intimate relationships, but also in our business dealings. If that were the case, then really could just cancel the Battle of Ideas and just kind of like stick you all in an MRI scanner or something and kind of work out what you're thinking. But just as a sort of sign of this, a recent Salon magazine article was entitled The Neuroscience of Facebook. It makes our brains happy. And actually, as it happens, there's a session going on about the Facebook generation as we speak, I believe. But anyway, there you go. I'm not from the world of science at all. And if anything, I'm from an academic level, I'm from the world of literature and arts, and I spend a lot of time going to those discussions. In recent years, you cannot have a discussion about the arts without somebody talking about neuroaesthetics and the importance of reading on the brain. And in fact, on Start the Week on Radio 4, one of the this week, for those of you who listen to British radio, but there was an interesting proponent, a very passionate proponent of better reading and deeper reading. I agreed with him all the way through, and he suddenly said, we know it's important for people to read because brain imaging shows us this particular part of the brain lighting up. And I just thought, it's everywhere and it's ubiquitous. But this session is not to just keep rehearsing that. We've done that a lot over recent years at the Battle of Ideas. And I think that we want to dig a bit deeper because I'm also a passionate supporter of scientific breakthroughs and want those to reveal more about our human condition. And so in some ways I get worried that neuroscience is actually getting a bad rap by its popularity. So partly what we want to do is to look at why neuroscience as an explanation for all things to all people has become fashionable, but also to look at the dangers to the science if it's misused, or whether in fact there are new things about human motivation that we are really able to understand now because of scientific breakthroughs. We at the Institute of Ideas are particularly concerned about a trend towards determinism in the broader cultural sense in society and an undermining of free will. That's where we started with this discussion. But maybe we're a bit defensive and maybe we need to ourselves take a step back and say, oh, maybe free will isn't as free as we think and maybe our brains did make us do it or whatever. So it's not a black and white for and against issue. We have one neuroscientist here. I say this as a slight warning, which is those of you who've decided that neuroscience is being misused is you're not going to hold him responsible for everything that's ever occurred in neuroscience. A, because it's over-flattering. Over-flattering, and B, because that's not really... They're not here like with their hats on in quite that way. They're here because they're interesting, and I think they'll say interesting things. Okay, I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. First of all, we've got Sally Satel, who, first of all, we're delighted to have over from America. And it's the first time she's actually spoken at the Battle, although we've known her from the Institute of Ideas and a great admirer of her work. She's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a psychiatrist and lecturer at Yale University of Medicine. She's the author of How Political Correctness is Corrupting Medicine, which is where I think we first came across her through that work, which was popular in our office, as I say. And more recently, and I suppose one of the reasons why we wanted to put this panel on is because she's got this new book out, Brainwashed, The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience, which she's the co-author of, is available in all good bookshops, but especially the Battle of Ideas one up at Foyles. Delighted to have you here. Can we give her a very warm welcome, please? Next, we'll hear from Julian Baggini, who is the founding editor of the Philosophers magazine. He writes, I think, in really smart comment pieces in everything from the FT to the Guardian to Prospect to New Statesman. Julian and I don't always agree, but I always enjoy his thought-provoking challenges. He's been writer in residence for the National Trust at the White Cliffs of Dover, which is so exciting, and at the Cheltenham Literary Festival and at Wellington College. He's the author of books such as Welcome to Every Town, A Journey into the English Mind, which I'd highly recommend, excellent book, and The Ego Trick. And excitingly, he appears as a cameo in 2 Alexander McCall Smith novels, which I thought was great. I mean, you want that in your bio, don't you? Anyway, give Julian a warm welcome, please. Third, we'll hear from Professor Geraint Rees, who is Director of UCL Cognitive Neuroscience, one of the world's leading centres for the study of mental processes in the human brain. He's Senior Clinical Fellow of the Wellcome Trust, and the Wellcome Trust, very important to our work because they both support the Debating Matters competition that we run for sixth formers, and are also the biomedical champion of the Battle of Ideas, and they're sponsoring the Strand next door. But anyway, there you go. Geraint leads internationally renowned research group studying the neural basis of human consciousness. In 2010, was elected Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and he works in cross-disciplinary fields and is developing the UCL strategic partnership with major new institutions such as the Francis Crick Institute, and hopefully a bit of cross-disciplinary development will go on today. Can we give Geraint a warm welcome, please? And finally, we'll have Dr. Bill Durodié, who is a professor and programme head of conflict analysis and management programmes at the Royal Rose University in Canada. And has come a long way to speak here, but as people will know, somebody that we try when we can to get to speak at the Battle of Ideas. He's an established scholar on risk analysis and communication, and is always very thoughtful when considering the issues of science and society, which is why we asked him here. He's an associate fellow of Chatham House, adjunct professor of CLAP, which is the top Chinese civil service and leadership education academy in Shanghai. He's been involved as an academic over recent years in Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, Cranfield University and King's College, and is the author of War on Terror or A Search for Meaning. Can we give Bill a warm welcome, please? Okay, Sally, kick us off with your 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay. Well, studying the brain has interested scholars and scientists for centuries, clearly, but really never before, I think, has it engaged the public imagination so vigorously. And I think one of the main reasons for that, the primary impetus behind this enthusiasm, is a form of brain imaging called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. I'm sure you've seen these iconic, vibrant pictures in the newspapers, various parts of the brain lit up, as they say. And it is a dazzling technology. There's no question, and there's no question at all that we have learned from it and will learn much more. However, as any neuroscientist will tell you, sometimes these images are highly vulnerable to misinterpretation. Now, that's an important thing to keep in mind. I know we're going to get back to that later. But in the excitement to explore the brain, we seem to have spawned a new fixation that my co-author and I call neurocentrism, the view that human behavior can be best explained by looking solely or primarily at the level of the brain, at the neurobiological level of explanation. Now, sometimes the neural level of explanation is appropriate. It's the level you want to be at. When scientists are developing diagnostic tests or medications for, let's say, Alzheimer's disease, of course they're going to investigate amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, the kinds of disruptions that interfere with disrupt communication in the brain. That's the level at which you want to be looking when we're trying to develop a new medication for schizophrenia or some sort of hopefully, we might even discover a neural signature that indicates predisposition. This is where we want to look, no question. But sometimes the neural level of explanation can lead us astray. In my own field, for example, of addiction psychiatry, neurocentrism is ascendant and not for the better. This is due largely to our National Institutes of Health, which promotes this as the rhetoric of addiction being a brain disease. The logic for that designation, as explained by its director, is that, quote, addiction is tied to changes in brain structure and function. Well, of course it is. Repeated use of heroin, cocaine, alcohol, cigarettes, all these alter neural circuits that mediate the experience of pleasure, motivation, memory, inhibition, and planning. We know this, and these modifications can be seen on brain scans. It's really, all this is quite amazing. However, we can't stop there. The critical question is whether this disruption that these substances induce, whether it proves by its very existence that addicts' behavior cannot be altered, that they aren't capable of self-control. And we know they're not. We know the power of incentives in shaping addictive behavior. We know that 90% of doctors get better because they're put in a program where they're going to lose their license. These kinds of consequences have meaning to people. We also know that spasms of self-reproach, for example, are what bring people into treatment. My child is disappointed in me. This is not who I am. I've done such things under addiction. Just imagine someone with Alzheimer's successfully willing to alter the course of their memory decline because because they were ashamed, or because there was some sort of reward at the end. Don't get any more demented, we'll give you $1 million, or if you do, we'll punish you. It's absurd. The brain changes of Alzheimer's do render people impervious to incentives and consequences, not so addiction. And it's very important also, I'll get off addiction in a minute, but this is one of my favorite topics, that we keep in mind the fact that people use for reasons, they continue to use, and they stop for reasons. For a policymaker and a clinician, this is key. For a neuroscientist interested in the mechanisms of reward, the brain level is key. But this is the important part. There are these levels of explanation, and we have to keep that in mind. It can't get basically narrowed down to this, collapsed into the brain level. Now, it's only natural that advances in knowledge about the brain would make us think more mechanistically about ourselves. But reading too much into scans can become truly consequential when things like the law hang in the balance. When a person commits a crime, the question, it's almost now a parody, is did he do it or did his brain do it? Well, that now this is a false choice, of course. If biology has taught us anything, it's that brain versus self in some ways is a false distinction. All our motives, our yearnings, our disappointments, memories are all, of course, in the brain. And again, captured on a scan, potentially. The problem is that it's too easy for non-professionals to assume, because we see these physical manifestations of neural activity, that somehow behavior is hardwired, involuntary, and uncontrollable. Sometimes it is, but at this time in our development of imaging, we can't, it's very difficult to discriminate between, let's say, an impulse that has been resisted and one that is irresistible. It's also very, very difficult, if not impossible at this time, for neuroscientists to help us basically translate the elements of what the law cares about into a scientific portrait. In other words, what can brain imaging tell us, again, in a forensic setting, not in a controlled lab setting, about intent, capacity to reason, to respond to reason, and for self-control? The answer in the forensic setting is almost nothing. At this time, you always have to add at this time, things may change. Pardon me. Yet, as I said, there's a powerful temptation to equate perceived physical cause with excuse. This is problematic, clearly, because every troublesome behavior is going to be reduced or traced, I should say, to brain activity. And if that's the case, then we can't hold anyone responsible. So this is not a productive route. I'll sum up by saying that, finally, of course, one of the major implications for brain science is the metaphysical ones. When we talk about what do we what are the implications, for example, for free will? Well, as I say, we'll get into this. I do think that the implications that some neuroscientists and others ascribe to brain science for free will, which is to say that it obliterates the notion and we should revise our criminal justice system accordingly, is way overblown. But more broadly, it is a fascinating issue, how we reconcile the advances in neuroscience, how the fact that we're going to be able to our biological explanations of behavior are going to get better and better and better. So what are the implications there for personal, civic, and legal notions of freedom? They're profound. My very last point is that the study of the brain is said to be the final scientific frontier, and I agree with that. It is one of the greatest intellectual achievements of mankind. The scans are dazzling, the technology is an unqualified marvel and getting better every day. But it's too easy for the non-expert to lose his bearings and to think that we can make too easy a leap from brain data to insights into the mind. But one way to keep our bearings, and I'll leave you with this, is that the brain and the mind are two different frameworks of explanation. The neurobiological domain is one of brains and physical causes, the mechanisms behind our thoughts, emotions, perceptions, valuations, decisions. The psychological domain is the realm of the mind that's one of people, its desires, intentions, ideals, and anxieties as we feel them and express them and are perceived by others to have them. Both are essential to a full understanding of why we act as we do. But focusing too much on the neural level can cause us to lose our minds in the age of brain science. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sally. Very clear exposition of the concerns there. Julian, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks so much. I have to say, I thought Sally's account there was absolutely spot on and lucid, and it's great this is being recorded, because if you go and play back that sort of 7 minutes again, I think you've got all the key points put so well. Now, in a sense, what I'm going to say is going to be very similar, but I want to try and sort of get to the bottom of what I think is the fundamental kind of mistake or trap we fall into, which makes us think that neuroscience is somehow a huge game changer, when fundamentally it isn't. As Sally said, it's teaching us all sorts of important things, and I don't want to belittle it. But the idea that it fundamentally transforms our conception of ourselves and threatens free will in a way that nothing before it has done is nonsense. Now, here's the analogy I want to use. In theology, you may be familiar with the idea of the God of the gaps. So this is the idea that people used to think that God controlled everything. Basically, God pulled all the levers. And then we discover natural science and that things actually happen through natural causes. Now, what do you do at that point? Well, one point is to say, we got the wrong... Well, you could just give up belief in God. That's one thing. You could say, we got the wrong idea of God. Whatever God is, it's not someone sitting there controlling everything in this kind of micromanaged way. Or you could say, well, actually, think about it. Science doesn't explain everything. What about those things where we haven't got explanations yet? God, that's where God is. Now, this God of the gaps strategy is criticised very much by mainly religious theologians. It's not an anti-religious point. They think this is a hopeless strategy. So you can see the problem. As science progresses, it's almost certainly going to be the case that those gaps are going to get smaller and smaller, and your God will become smaller and smaller. Now, in the same kind of way, I think we fall into this sort of trap of the kind of the I of the gaps, or the self of the gaps. Similarly, just as we understood the world basically worked on materialist forces many centuries ago, so we actually did realise that human beings are biological creatures, physical creatures. We're made up of that kind of stuff and nothing else. And I think somehow, consciously or not, deliberately or not, coherently or not, some sense pervaded that in this mechanistic, physicalist framework, there were gaps. There were things that couldn't be explained by physical processes alone, and that's where you'd find the self. Now, the reason neuroscience, I think, is so challenging is that it kind of closes the final gaps. Now, the point is the process of closing the gaps started absolutely ages ago. Anyone clear-eyed, even 3 or 4 centuries ago, would have seen where this was going, would have realised that if you are to retain some sense of human dignity, rationality, and selfhood and so forth, you could not do so by trying to imagine that the true essence of self would somehow find its way in between the gaps left by a physical account of the universe. So What's the alternative to that then? Well, just as you can give up belief in God, you could give up belief in the self. You could say it's all just an illusion, reason and rationality are just epiphenomena sitting on biological processes. But that actually makes very, very little sense whatsoever. And this picks up something, again, that Sally was saying. Because if you actually want to look and explain why human beings do things, you cannot possibly get anywhere if you restrict yourself to the purely neural level. You can only begin to understand what we're doing here if you understand that we are creatures that at one level, the fundamental materialist physical level, if you like, are products of causation, chains of causation, molecules, atoms hitting atoms, etc., etc. But it's quite evident, it is a fundamental datum of the world, I think, that we are also creatures who behave according to reasons and have meanings and values. If I say to you, if I was to shout, duck, and you ducked, for example, sure, there is some account of the universe in which you could see my sort of, the voice waves rippling through the air, going into your ear, affecting the brain and so forth. You could, if you like, come up with some kind of way of following what was going on at that purely physical level. But quite clearly, the reason why you ducked was because I said duck, and you understand the meaning of that term, and that's why you did it. Now, how this works, how this all fits together, how somehow these physical brains, which operate according to purely physical laws, are able to also be bearers of meaning and understand things and create things like values and so forth, is not clear. That is somewhat, let's say, mysterious, let's say, very least unexplained. But that it is the case seems to be absolutely evident. I think it's just flying in the face of all we know about how we live, that we are not just creatures of causes in the physical sense, we're also creatures of reasons. We don't just do things because neurons fire, we do things because we understand we have desires and purposes and so forth. And none of that is to deny, of course, that at the bottom of it is our brains. I think part of the problem here is, again, this use of what I'd call the diminishing or demeaning just or only or but. People say, you're saying we're just physical brains, we're only kind of biological robots. We'll take away the words only and just, and I think that's kind of fine. The point is to say you're a biological robot, for example, is not to say that therefore you're a creature who doesn't have any values or doesn't understand things, doesn't have reasons for doing things, or isn't capable of rational reflection. So the important thing is to see there really is fundamentally no threat, or there should be no threat to the belief that we are people who act out of reasons and so forth, from the understanding that underneath it all are brain processes. I mean, put it bluntly, what do you expect to sit underneath it all? Ectoplasm? I mean, no, it's got to be brain stuff, hasn't it? So having said that, just to introduce finally a small sort of challenge though, does it mean that our conception of ourselves can remain naively exactly the same as it was before we understood how brain works and so forth? Well, no. There are specific challenges, for sure. And I think, we understand more specifically the ways in which biological and neurological processes might be directing us in ways we're not fully aware of. And that is true. That may also get us to revise the naive conception we have of our free will and so forth. But the idea it throws away these things is to make the fundamental mistake of going right back to that sort of eye of the gaps thing, which is not to realise from the beginning that the fact that we accept that brains are ultimately the engines of the self, the things that make things possible, in no way denies the fact that we are people who, at the same time, reason, think, and do things because of reasons, because of values, because of desires, not merely because neurons are firing.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Julian. I mean, a really very helpful kind of moving the discussion on reflection, I think. So I will come back to quite a lot of the things that you thought. I don't know that we all know the answers to them, but it's exactly the way I think we need to be thinking about it. Geraint.
Thanks. So I'm a clinical neurologist, and I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. So that means I spend most of my time studying mental processes in the human brain, the mapping between reason and neurons that Julian was talking about, and I use functional magnetic resonance imaging and other brain imaging technologies that Sally was mentioning. We study the human brain rather than, say, the mouse brain or any other sort of brain, because we want to get closer to what it is we're trying to explain. So what I'm trying to explain is essentially why people do the things they do. Human behaviour, that's fundamentally what I'm interested in, the richness of what we do as a species. So I'm particularly interested in the constellation of behaviours that are individually special but perhaps collectively unique. Consciousness, self-awareness, extended social learning, language, and so on. You can probably come up with your own list, but collectively they make us unique as a species. And I'm particularly interested in why people do those things. Now, it takes only a moment's reflection to realize that just even thinking about those behaviors I've mentioned, they're incredibly complex on their own as natural phenomena. And we also, of course, know that the brain is an incredibly complex organ itself. So even understanding the part that the brain, amongst other things, might play in those behaviors is going to be incredibly difficult. And I find it daily amazing that we make even a small amount of progress. So that makes the question underlying all this of whether there are limits to neuroscience incredibly hard to answer. And I think my honest response would be, we don't know. But it's a discussion, and in the spirit of discussion, I want to make two opening points. So the first is that quite a lot of this debate, in my experience, seems to boil down to the fact we don't yet know how to account for subjective experience. That is, the types of experiences you're all having now that are private to yourself unless you choose to share them by gesture or communication or some other form. And because of that, we worry that perhaps providing an account of behaviors and reasons and things like that in terms of what's happening in our brain might somehow undermine that experience itself. Now, in a trivial sense, that's clearly not true. Understanding how my car works doesn't diminish my pleasure in driving. Understanding the Higgs boson doesn't diminish our wonder at the universe. But in a deeper sense, there are legitimate questions because science, of course, is an account of objectively observable phenomena, some of which are subject to what we call laws of nature or of the universe. And our awareness and our self-awareness seem to be irreducibly subjective. Now, that isn't a new question, that relationship, or whether we can account for that. It's been fruitlessly debated for millennia. I think the bottom line here is we still really don't have any idea whether it's the case that subjective experience might be accounted for or in some sense explained by objectively observable phenomena. And in my area, I illustrate this whenever I talk to an audience by asking people to put up their hands if they think a gorilla is conscious, like us. And pretty much all the audience will put up their hands to that. And then the next question is, well, okay, what about a cat or a dog? And some people will put their hands down, and then we go down the scale, mouse, ant, amoeba, pick your own species. And sometimes we even have to go down to inanimate objects because, of course, there are perfectly respectable philosophical positions that hold that this table is in some sense conscious or has some sort of relationship to our conscious experience. And so what that's telling us is not that people are stupid or people are wrong. It's telling us that we're actually using our intuitions about that to answer that question. And so my goal, or one of my goals as a scientist, is to try and help with that question. And I think the way we help with that question is we do sensible experiments in a measured way to try and find out if we can get a little closer to the answer. So second point is partly related to the question of free will. If we want to understand why people do what they do, then brains are just one part of the picture. I think none of us in this audience, I hope, are going to say that if our brains were removed or rendered inactive, that we would carry on having the same range of behaviours we have. The brain is in some sense important for how we behave and how we think. But brains are in bodies. Bodies are in a physical environment, and those brains in bodies encounter lots of other brains in bodies, just like we're doing now. So if you're asking the question, what am I going to do in 5 minutes' time, or 5 hours' time, or 5 days' time, knowing the precise physical state of my brain, it might be a little bit helpful, but it's not going to be the answer, is it? Because what happens in the next 5 minutes is going to be determined in part by the physical state of my environment, the physical state of your brains, the physical state of stuff outside this room, perhaps even non-biological features of the environment like the meteorite that might crash through the roof of the cinema in the next half an hour. Now, the good news is that all of those, in a sense, are physical systems, so they're amenable to various different branches of science in terms of at least coming up with an account of how they all interoperate. But the bad news is, of course, that's incredibly complicated. That's even more complicated than what I put as the incredibly complicated task of just understanding why somebody does what they do and the part that the brain plays in that. So there are fields of neuroscience that address that. Some parts of my institute are very interested in social neuroscience and understanding what happens in people's brains when two people interact. And you'll notice, by the way, as an aside, I've been very careful to try and avoid this mereological fallacy of ascribing to brains something that's properly a property of people. People think, people have reasons, people have experiences. Brains are part of that, and we as cognitive neuroscientists try to help understand and explain that. But I think it would be wrong to say that the brain thinks. People think, and brains have patterns of neural firing, at least in my view. And quite a lot, I think, of our misunderstanding about this comes about when scientists or commentators or other people make this slippage between proper levels of description and levels of inquiry. So I'm going to wrap up now, and just to say, to return to the question of their limits to what neuroscience can know, my answer is I have no idea. But I would say that we can only, from a scientific point of view, get closer to finding out and illuminating that question by doing some careful experiments that are informed by the sort of considerations that we're discussing here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Geraint. And I think that's very useful as well to have those finer distinctions drawn attention to, and we can look at why, if that were the case and generally understood, we wouldn't be needing to have this debate to a certain extent, but it's kind of a useful way of kind of coming back on you afterwards. But now, finally, in the formal sense from the front, Bill, your thoughts, please.
Well, if you step outside this hall at the end of the day, you'll notice there's quite a lot of leaves that have fallen onto the pavement, and some of them have left an imprint there and blown away, and you get these beautiful patterns left on the pavement. If I were to show you a photograph of one of those prints, I think about 90% of people in this room, if I asked, what do you see, you would say, the print of a leaf. But that's not what you see. That's your interpretation of what you see. What you see is a patch of color superimposed on another patch of color. And you interpret what you see because you have experiences prior to seeing the photograph of leaves, of chemical processes whereby maybe dye would be removed and remain on the pavement. And you also have experiences of things changing over time, that something that was there is no longer there. And in fact, most of what human activity is interpretation of the data that we perceive through our senses, rather than just the mere representation of that data. And that interpretation can be contested. Science tries to avoid that contestation by repeating experiments, by having large numbers of experiments, and by looking at the significance of the results that are revealed. But we have to say, by the way, that neuroscience is notoriously plagued by very small signals coming from very small numbers of volunteers who are prepared to put their heads into a scanner. Enhanced, as Sally pointed out, through the amazing imagery capacity of information technology. But those images are still contested. And neuroscience is also, in many ways, a fledgling science, and accordingly plagued by numerous disagreements, even amongst its proponents. I think Geraint was, in a way, an exemplar of that, in as much as he is prepared to concede that a brain on its own doesn't explain much. It needs to be understood in context with its environment, with other brains. But there are other neuroscientists who don't see it that way. So the first thing we need to understand is that there is that contestation of interpretation and meaning. Others have also pointed out that some neuroscientists notoriously try to smuggle in the language of consciousness into how they describe the processes that are going on in the brain. So they will say things like neurons signal, or provide information, or respond to. But neurons can't do those things. That's what we as human beings do. There's just an electrical impulse. It's also a language plagued by vague language. So neuroscientists will talk about something being associated with something else or influenced by something else. But these are descriptions, not explanations. It's also the case that you perceive many things simultaneously, and somehow you have to prioritize the thing that maybe the experimenter is asking you to prioritize, and you even have activity in your brain that you're entirely unconscious of. You know, that you're maintaining a state of homeostasis at the moment, requiring you to maintain balance, temperature, and various other things that are all going on and that cloud what's happening in your mind. I'm saying all this not because I want to dismiss neuroscience, but just because I think it's important to highlight that it's a contested field with some important barriers. I think it also suffers from presenting a deficit model of the brain as well. There's a lot of focus on what happens when a part of the brain is damaged and what that reveals, supposedly, about what would normally be there. But, you know, suggesting that normality is the opposite of damage is a bit like saying I want to study democracy through only looking at dictatorships, because I'm presuming that one is the opposite of the other. And that's not true. And so I think there are some limits to some of the experiments that are circulated. Geraint also pointed out that he thinks that this is incredibly complicated. I think that's putting it very, very mildly. You know, if I wanted to study a butterfly colony, for instance, I could say, well, all things are physical ultimately. Butterflies are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and therefore all I need to do is sum up where all the protons, neutrons, and electrons are and look at how they interact and move across time. But of course, essentially, I would not have sufficient time in the universe to actually determine what is going to happen. And hence, I don't use physics to understand butterfly colonies. I think E.O. Wilson was onto something when he suggested that maybe sociology should be seen as a branch of biology. My thoughts and actions may be reflected in my brain, but they're part, as I think Geraint pointed this out, of a social field of relations, not just a neural or chemical one. A slip of the tongue may leave a neural or chemical signature that can be measured, but it's a really uninteresting way of describing what happens. You know, my degree of embarrassment will have nothing to do with that neural or chemical signature, or have to do with social context. Likewise, neuroscience, I don't think, is about to explain anything particularly sophisticated or important, like the existence of slavery or sex discrimination. We all know, and it's unfortunate, and I'm not accusing anybody on the panel of this, that neuroscience and the language of it has been hijacked by other people for often pre-existing agendas. I largely work in the field of security, and I could show you a whole series of US Department of Defense white papers, such as the ones I have in front of me, the neurobiology of political violence, neuroscience insights on radicalization, and the list is endless. So this language has been hijacked and adapted to many, many other fields. But to suggest that neuroscience is somehow corrupting or influencing society is actually to put things entirely the wrong way round. Science, and I'll finish on this, whilst shaping society, is also a product of the particular society and cultural mood that it emerges within. And today, and I think it's been noted throughout this conference, some people would be able to categorize that cultural mood as one of a degree of a fear of change, a sense of limits, a feeling of fragility, which encourages a particularly dystopian outlook. That dystopian outlook, whether they know it or not, guides many scientists in what they then go off and investigate. And as a consequence of that, we have apocalyptic interpretations of environmental science and deterministic presumptions that Sally touched on, presented by neuroscience. Very last point. I understand that a few in this room may have been Marxists once upon a time. So I just wanted to remind you of something that Marx wrote in his introduction to the contribution to a critique of Hegel's philosophy of right of 1844, two elements of which I think are very pertinent to this discussion. It's an article most famous for the phrase that religion is the opium of the people, but these two other quotes I think are more significant. He says, theory becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses. So here you have a materialist who knows that matter is not all that matters, and that ideas can have a material impact. And the other quote he makes is, "The immediate task of philosophy, once the holy form of human self-estrangement has been unmasked, is to unmask self-estrangement in its unholy forms." And therefore, we have gone through a period when we have revealed the limits of religious determinism, and what I want to suggest to you this afternoon is now we need to reveal the limits of neurodeterminism. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. That was really interesting and excellent. Although I did note that I didn't need an MRI scanner to note a number of people jump when you said there are a number of Marxists in the room, looking suspiciously at the people next to them. But there you go. I've got lots of questions, but I'm actually going to start by asking you, Geraint, just frankly, how you feel about, as a neuroscientist and the work that you're doing, the cavalier way, in many ways, that policy makers have started using, citing neuroscience, or the way it's used popularly as an explanation. Do you think that's problematic for you, or do you know what I mean about the worry about that, or is it not a bother to you?
No, of course it bothers me. I'm a human too, right? And I live in the world too, and I want policy to be made in a just and evidence-based way. And I want that evidence to be used and interpreted appropriately. On the other hand, I'm glad that neuroscience as a field attempts to seek out and engage public policymakers, quite a few diverse audiences, and I'm pleased that the public, the policymakers, other people want to engage with neuroscience. Far better that way than the other way around of two completely different worlds and two completely different silos in splendid isolation. So I think I've got mixed feelings, would be the truth about that.
Julian, I was actually thinking the enthusiasm for evidence-based policy. I feel, at least, that many people in public policy and political fields seem to want to hide behind that almost. So to give you an example, attempts at explaining children's behaviour through the medical prism and then there's kind of use of Ritalin and all those kind of things. And even then, the way in education policy circles now, it's become popular to say, oh, well, we can't control the behaviour of these children because they've got this syndrome, they've got that syndrome. Do you know what I mean? It's not neuroscience entirely. And actually, when we debated that the other night, I mean, that was what people were saying who are not from neuroscience. So it became a handy way of saying it's not our fault, Gov, they've got something wrong with their brains.
Well, there's several different things in there. There is at the bottom of this a sense, it seems to be the case that people think if you can show something in the brain, you've shown it's real in a way that no other evidence can show it is real, which I think is very, very strange. So, you can see what happens to people in various different circumstances. You can see, for example, how children respond to, I don't know, being loved or not loved, and all these various things, incentives, having sugar and all that stuff. But the moment someone says, but we now can show this is what happens in their brain, this becomes, well, that's it then. That's a fact, and we can then move on. And really, I think that there are various problems with that, partly because although I'm not a neuroscientist, of course, it is always the case that one always has to be very careful about interpreting these things for various reasons. I think that some of the more scientifically literate people here might be able to explain better than me. But, studies tend to show these correlations and very, very local and specific links between things, which people are very keen to jump on and generalise, though that has shown the cause or the mechanism. So there is a danger of massively over-interpreting the science. But there's also a question of just simply not paying attention to the other kind of evidence, which in a sense is even more indisputable and in front of our eyes. So, if you want to look at, for example, look, why do people, why are people unhappy in their work? I mean, that's a good question. Why are some jobs very unsatisfying and why are some people miserable in their work? Well, I think the best way of answering that is to have a look at the workplace and see what they say about it and how they're paid and their conditions and all that kind of thing. Whereas actually, there is a sort of trend to think, well, people are unhappy in their work because silly things about, their serotonin levels and how sort of like being in this sort of environment affects this, that, and the other. Now, it's not that those things aren't true. Perhaps they are true, but that's diverting us from actually what is the most practical and relevant way in. And I suppose that's the fundamental worry about all of this. It's not that, I'm very pleased that no one in this panel has simply laid into neuroscience and said it's all bollocks, it's all not true and everything else. Even if it's true that, what's going on when someone is miserable is exactly this or that process in the brain, is extremely unhelpful almost all the time in determining what you're going to do to make them feel happier about it. So in that sense, my fear is it makes us take the eye off the ball. And it's in policy making as well. The eye off the ball in policy, why on earth most the departments of education and so forth, they've got very little. I'm not saying they've got nothing to pick up from neuroscience, but there's much, much more to be learned just from observation and other data.
Two small points. I mean, I agree with most of that, but not all of that. So I think one is the horses for courses thing, that one should always try to answer questions at the correct, whatever that is, and we don't necessarily know level, is an important one. But sometimes neuroscience is helpful in finding out that a particular difficulty or particular abnormality in some part of the brain is associated with some pattern of behavior, because it can give us clues about how to change that. That's not to say, as you correctly say, that is the cause necessarily, nor is it to say that that's at the root of the causal chain, as Sally was talking about earlier. But it can be helpful. The second short point I'd want to is I think scientists, and particularly non-scientists, often seem to be in some kind of quest to find the right level. So there's this kind of thing that goes all the way, as Bill was saying, from protons and neutrons all the way up to butterflies flapping around, or even humans in lecture theatres discussing things. And that somehow there must be a correct level in between there. And if only we can find that correct level. Now, I'm a scientist and a clinician who spends most of my life not trying to find the correct level, but trying to understand the mapping between levels. And that's the essence of what cognitive neuroscience is, between the behaviour of whole people, behind what we think are mental processes in the brain, and their mapping, if there is one, into neural processes.
This point about the right level, I think you're right. Sometimes I think people want to, as it were, discover what is always the right level for everything. Yeah. That isn't the case. So, for example, in the very well-intentioned and generally speaking, I think, helpful desire not to fall into the trap of thinking, obesity is simply a disease which has nothing to do with lifestyle, etc., etc., it would be ridiculous then to ignore the fact that, for example, some people are overweight simply because they have an underactive thyroid. Sometimes the brain is the explanation, and it is the best explanation and the most helpful explanation. The point is, I think, more often than not it isn't. But you'll be right, it'd be equally silly to sort of claim that one should never consider the brain stuff to be relevant, or sometimes even the most important thing.
I know it's not strictly neuroscience, but I've sat in on policy discussions where they have literally sat and talked about people and how they can manipulate them because of the gains that have been made in psychology and neuroscience, which, they know about as much about as I do, by the way, generally. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is a serious discussion that goes on. And I think that there is sometimes an attempt at finding easy ways of solving problems. Not just, the overactive thyroid, as you say, sometimes there's a biological explanation, but sometimes it can be that, particularly in policy, that they've given up trying to persuade us. And they therefore think, is there another way of doing this? Or, you know what I mean? And so on and so forth to get round that. So anyway, Sally, come back, and then anyone else, yeah.
Not to beat a dead neuron on this, but because I think that exchange was illuminating, but maybe just add another bit of convergent evidence in terms of the fact that cause, which we can interpret on several different levels, doesn't necessarily itself even point to the solution. And here's an example. You could have a patient. I did have a patient who had profound depression, the kind where I thought, well, this person's going to need shock therapy. And it turned out that despite the severity of the symptoms, we didn't do any neurohormonal testing, but I'm sure the cortisol would have been high as a kite, and probably other neurochemical derangements. Yet, this is a person who, to my incredible surprise, responded to cognitive behavioral therapy. She even had what one would even call the old term for it was endogenous depression. In other words, a non-reactive depression. It wasn't that she could point to something that even went wrong. She just pretty much woke up one day the way you would have a cold, although it was a much more severe phenomenon for her, clearly. But the point is that even though this seemed to be as close to a kind of a spontaneous problem of neural transmission, whatever, we really don't even know exactly what depression is about, but in terms of mechanism, we know a ton, but I can't summarize it for you in a second, in terms of some final explanation. That said, still, the route to her improvement was actually psychological and behavioral. And conversely, I had a patient who lost a job. If only he got his job back, this is a person who could imagine what could make him feel better. In fact, the most severe depressions are often characterized by people who can't even imagine what could make themselves feel better. But he knew it. All I had to do is get my job back or get another one. And yet, it was only through, even though he did get a job, it was only through medication that he finally actually recovered his pre-morbid status, as we would call it. So there's no, the lesson one draws from that is that both these levels clearly are important to understand, but they don't even in and of themselves, they don't inevitably point to the remedy.
Okay, thanks. So Bill's going to say a few words, and then, so audience, I'm going to come out and just open the conversation up to you, batches of 5 or 6 points, and we'll see. I'll get the conversation with the panel going.
Well, actually, I mean, it's more a question maybe aimed at Geraint, and it's, I mean, you say, I understand why neuroscientists seek to engage other audiences. I'm curious, who are these other audiences? What is it that you feel you've achieved that can be usefully shared with them? I mean, maybe there's a case to be made for scientists, indeed, focusing on the science and coming up with a few results prior to reaching for the megaphone, although I'm not suggesting that that's what you're arguing, because this language has certainly morphed into arenas where it is, I think, wholly unproductive. By the way, just as a quick aside, I did point out in another session yesterday that I don't think it's for neuroscientists to critique the abuse of the language of neuroscience in other areas. I think it's for all of us to be critical of that if we want to rein that in.
So I guess my immediate response would be firstly to pick you up on the caricature of the megaphone. I think that's an outdated and unhelpful way of characterizing what neuroscientists or indeed any other scientist is seeking to do. It's not about, I found something out, so now I'm going to sit here in a lecture theatre and broadcast it to you and adopt, as it were, the English tourist abroad. If at first you don't understand, I'll speak slower and louder until you do. That is not what I'm meaning at all, and I don't think that characterizes how scientists or neuroscientists seek to engage. It's about a dialogue. And to give a specific example, we've been talking about policymakers making supposedly evidence-based decisions on the basis of interpretations of evidence that, as my panelists seem to be suggesting to me, they barely understand or have any experience of scientific methodology or the scientific method. That's not to say that scientists should control that, but I think the idea that perhaps our parliamentarians or people like that might like to have people with that kind of knowledge to advise them if they so wish, I think is the sort of engagement I'm talking about.
So who and what?
Well, scientific engagement in making evidence-based policy.
Can you give an concrete example?
Well, for example, we've heard that people discussing nudge therapy have no idea about, in one person's opinion, about the quality of the evidence, the type of evidence, or what is known neuroscientifically about whether one can indeed influence people's behavior. I think neuroscience might have something useful to say about what that evidence is, and that can then be evaluated in the policy-making process.
Okay, I'm going to go out to the audience. There's loads to say.
I just want to begin in relation to the objective-subjective dichotomy by asking the panel, how long is a piece of string? The division between the mind and the body is something that we will never, ever know, so you might as well give up the ghost with that. The second point is an emphasis on the brain, reducing things to the brain in terms of power, is that there has to be something objective, something perceptible in order to govern and control, and I'm talking, and not to mention create markets, and I'm talking here in relation to the pharmaceutical industry. But I just want to finish by drawing on the work of Ian Hacking, and he talks about natural kinds and human kinds. Now, Alzheimer's is a natural kind in that it's objective, whereas depression is a human kind in that it's discursive and subjective. And I just want to leave that with the panel and see what you think about it.
Thanks for a fascinating discussion. And I agreed a great deal with much of what particularly Sally and Julian said about the misguided the misinterpretations of neuroscience to explain behaviour like addiction. But I suppose that anybody must bear in mind that there's a great mystery about the relation of mind and brain, and that at the same time they are clearly very intimately related in a way we don't understand. Some people think they're identical, some people think they're just causally interactive and so on, but there's got to be some relation. And so we can't just say, oh, well, let's forget neuroscience when we try to explain behaviour. We've got to integrate it somehow. Now, I just wonder whether so many attempts so far have been to say, okay, the more we understand about the brain, the more we'll understand about the mind. Often meaning by this, there's no more to mind than the brain, or there's not much more to it. But what might actually happen is that the project of neuroscience is a very good project. We know very little about it, and once more is known, and it might be we know only a millionth now of what should be known, the more the brain will come to see like what the mind always seemed to be. Because the brain is this mysterious organ with these very strange properties. They can somehow manifest or connect with or even be mental properties. Real understanding of the brain might, as it were, mentalize the brain in just the way that so many neuroscience now think that understanding the mind just physicalizes the mind. So really, the real direction of neuroscience is that, real understanding of the brain actually brings us in line with the intuitions that Julian and Sally were arguing for, and which I agree with.
In immediate response to the last thing that was said on the panel, that come to the defence of coverage of neuroscience in the media, and I think we should. It's a good thing. We should encourage it, and if it's been misused, if words have been misused, they need to be corrected. But banishing it from the media is not the answer. So we want to science literacy is a good thing, whether it's among journalists and among the general public. We've known that since the Enlightenment, that having a scientifically literate public leads to more functional societies. I'm glad that the panel has been talking in terms of layers. I think that's an interesting framework to work on, and layers of abstraction. And I think maybe by analogy we could look at computer programming and computers. And I know it's a dangerous metaphor to use. I'm not suggesting that computers are autonomous, but if you want to interact with a computer, you can do so at a higher level, interacting with a program. You can a middle level, interacting with code, and very rarely would you ever deal with the ones and zeros that makes the whole system function. So likewise with neuroscience, explaining things in terms of chemical interaction between neurons is not to say that the solution to the way we deal with the brain and interact with it is to get involved at the micro level. So I guess my question would be, the notion of hacking has sort of ballooned outside computing. So you have things of life hacking, and nudge as a form of sort of society hacking. And I say hacking not to break into, but to sort of tinker and find unusual solutions. So is there neurohacking? Is there a future for it?
I want to follow up with Bill Durodié's point about what happens when ideas have a material impact. And the difficulty here is if we confine the debate to examples of how policymakers use science, there's a danger of seeing neuroscience as the real focus or nudge as the real focus. And we have to look more broadly, because psychiatry and therapy and counselling are now increasingly being combined with bits of neuroscience, bits of nudge, bits of psychiatry, etc., to intervene in very broad areas of social policy. In the name of intervening in troubled families, we have bits of neuroscience and the neglected brain. We have quite a lot of COD psychoanalysis about damaging emotional legacies from neglect and all sorts of other psychological and material conditions. So the danger is how does neuroscience, not in its pure form, get aligned with these other bits, these reductionist, popularised bits of science. And I think psychiatry is as much to blame as neuroscience in how this gets appropriated in policy. And we have to have real examples of where policymakers appropriate this, either knowingly or not knowingly in terms of evidence, and then use them in real material interventions across social policy.
Yeah, I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball in here. I have previously had really quite bad brain damage. Hopefully, speaking now, you can tell that it's pretty much gone away. As a few years old, I was very incapacitated for 3 to 4 years. I did offer my brain quite freely to the Institute of Neurology, but they kind of said no thank you. So I took my brain to the USA, and I did get some treatment, and thankfully it's a lot better. Bill's example of the leaf, I could not watch the leaves moving on the trees, or the birds flying in the sky, or anybody particularly moving around in front of me. I had very severe damage to my spatial area of my brain. My rational part of my brain, thank heavens, was undamaged, which enabled me to then pursue a way of getting better. Had I had the rational part of the frontal lobes of my brain damaged, then I probably wouldn't have found the solution. So essentially, I know what it's like to have parts of my brain that previously did one thing, then suddenly, overnight, not to do it, then to get better. So the brain is, I can see, I'm sorry, on the end you're rubbing your head and go, oh my goodness, this might be undermining a little of what I've already said. However, I can absolutely tell you that the brain not functioning has a profound effect on the whole of one's life and how one reacts then to the world around us.
Now, it was just a question about policy making and the appeal, or to take a word from Sally's book title, The Seductive Appeal of Neuroscience to Policymakers, what the panel's thoughts on that are, and also, by extension, what are, we've seen this a lot in climate science, I think, and what are the potential consequences of that relationship for neuroscience itself, Vanni?
Before I ask my question, it's important to my question, if you'd indulge me, I'd just be curious of the people on the panel, how many of you believe that you have free will?
I would say it depends on your definition.
I haven't got any, I have no hesitation to put my hand up whatsoever.
All right, that's very useful. That's very useful. So, yes, I don't believe that I do, and I think that free will was a dead concept 2,500 years ago when Democritus and Eusebius adduced atomism. I just don't think there's any chance. It's philosophically incoherent. It doesn't make sense in physics. Even if you understand behavioral genetics, it just doesn't make any sense. But even I, dyed in the wool as I am, and I think there are extraordinary prescient insights which come from behavioral genetics and neuroscience and so on. Even I, Claire, I think your comments at the beginning of this, the kind of motivation for the panel, are excellent. It's so dangerous to oversell what we know. We mostly don't know. We're really at the cusp of discovery here, and the insights and the apparent, if you will indulge me, illusion of free will is so woven into the fabric of our societies, ourselves, our cultures, our relationships. To think you can come along with a study and go, okay, that's all bullshit, ministers should do something, we aren't even close to being at that level. So even as the hard determinist that I am, and I'm sure many people will disagree with that, even I absolutely agree with your concerns.
Right, so panel.
Well, I'll try and be brief. I mean, just briefly up there, I'm sure that everyone on the panel completely accepts the fact that, of course, if your brain is damaged in certain ways, you're going to have problems with your functioning and so forth. No one's claiming that the brain has... I would just agree with you. It's a bit odd that you seem to think that you might be challenging something on the panel. Lots of things said there, and Piers' suggestion was a very interesting one about how neuroscience might progress so that mind and brains come to seem more of the same thing. But I want to pick up this broad thread of the evidence base. I think this is a very interesting thing because there's a sense in which wanting an evidence base for policy seems to be absolutely unobjectionable. I mean, do you want non-evidence-based policy? Do you want evidence without any idea what will happen? But I think the desire to provide an evidence base can, if not used very carefully, lead to all sorts of bad things, which is essentially this. If you want evidence, what's the clearest kind of evidence? Well, it's the things you can either measure precisely and come up with numbers for, Or it becomes things that really you can't measure very precisely, like well-being, happiness, but which you go out and ask a team to come up with metrics to measure them. So you either get sort of bogus metrics or only the things that can be measured in that way. Whereas if you think about it, in terms of public policy, is to create a better society. And I think there is no algorithm for a good society. We have to make decisions about values. Fundamentally, it's about values. If we to say that, if we had this debate earlier on Scandinavia, to believe that Scandinavia is a better society than, say, the United States of America or vice versa, sure, you need to sort of evidence plays a role in that discussion. But ultimately, it's fundamentally about what kind of values you prefer, what kind of values you want to see embodied in the society. And you can't settle that debate simply by pointing to the numbers. The numbers are nonetheless relevant to your discussion. So I think that in this kind of case, I know it's taking us a bit broader than that, but the question was inviting us to broaden out a bit. I think we need to be very careful about the extent to which the desire to base things in evidence can lead people to focus too much on what is most straightforwardly measurable and demonstrable, and that can distract us from other things around values, which I think in a public policy sphere are very, very important.
Well, I can follow straight on from that, actually, because things that are evident are not necessarily real. Going to a world which I know and I'm more familiar with in relation to the world of security, I do get a bit worried when people say we talk to policymakers about what we know in science, because in the world of security, the equivalent would be to say, well, what do we know about terrorism? Well, mostly they're foreigners, and mostly they claim to support Islam or to believe in Islam, and actually, those may be factually true to a large extent, but it's actually how do you interpret that evidence that matters. Mostly they might be foreigners, but to me, it's quite striking how influenced they have been by Western and dystopian ideas and ideals of nihilism and narcissism that exist here. They claim Islam, but Islam, to me, is more their motif than their motive. So you can look at even things that are evidently true need to be interpreted through a political and moral prism. And the danger here is that we're failing to do that.
Sure, things need to be interpreted in that way, but we also need the evidence in the first place. That is, if we didn't actually know those facts, as Bill put them, we wouldn't even be in a position to reason about the political and theoretical prism through which we view them. So I think that from my point, is science isn't necessarily uninfluenced by the context in which it happens. We've made that point on the panel already. There's ample evidence of that. The types of things that people choose to study, Julian talking about the types of evidence that might be available, are influenced in context. I was struck when you were talking, I was reflecting about a debate about evidence-based medicine, which was very prominent when I was training as a doctor. This was meant to be the new thing, that doctors, as we know, are very poor at making appropriate decisions on the basis of evidence, and therefore we should teach them all to be better Bayesian reasoners, and we should do randomized controlled trials. And that's all kind of very, very good. But then the area I work in is often a kind of one where the patients are more, as it were, bespoke, in the sense that you deal with very, very rare neurological diseases, where it is much harder to come up with hundreds of thousands of patients in a trial because there aren't that many patients in the world. So what does one do when one's confronted with that situation? Say we can't do evidence-based medicine, so therefore we'll just stop thinking about treatments for those people. Of course not. But that illustrates in a different context, I think, the limits or the ways one can be distorted by the irrepressible desire for evidence. Perhaps to put it on a different frame, quickly, it's about thought-based policy, isn't it? It's about thinking about values, it's about thinking through the consequences, it's about sifting the evidence, and it's being about aware of the contextual and political influences.
Sally.
Okay, two quick things. Someone mentioned scientific literacy. Well, of course, that's vastly important, but there are two developments that are kind of unfortunate and muddy the waters, and one is the culture of press releases. They come out, not all of them, some of them are more restrained and responsible, but others are virtually histrionic, the way they tout new studies, usually neuroscience, or cocaine is as addictive as the Oreo cookies, that was the newsflash du jour when I left town. Anyway, they're exaggerated, they're not, they're distorted, and I don't, not all of them, but enough of them are. Then they're interpreted, then they get in the hands not of careful science journalists who go back and interview the researchers themselves or read the peer-reviewed paper, which should have come out and didn't in the case of this Oreo cookie thing. It doesn't exist yet. In any case, the best science people are not reporting on many of these studies, unfortunately. It's beat writers who were just given this assignment. And say one more thing? Yeah. Mr. Hard Determinist. Clearly this debate, free will has been around for quite a while. This metaphysical debate of, I define the free will enigma is basically how do you reconcile a determinist universe with the existence of moral authority. And I do think it's a determined universe. I happen to be a compatibilist. But the point is that neuroscience can't resolve this conundrum. It's been with us forever, and it will continue to be. And I'm a little dismayed, and not at you, but at other folks in the field who are so smart about so many things, but they actually think if we understand the mechanisms of the brain, that will resolve the problem. No, it won't. It will just give more evidence of how we are determined in that sense. But whether or not, as people, we have moral agency is, again, that eternal question of what we think enough freedom is. And enough freedom for Claire and for me is that we're conscious, that we deliberate, that we plan, and that we control ourselves. And
Okay.
we can find the neural mechanism of those too, but it doesn't answer the question about free will.
I really loved it when Professor Rees kept saying, well, we don't really know, because it reminded me, I've been working with a neuroscientist on a show, and every time he says, so what exactly happens in the brain when such and such? And he would give us this long explanation, anterior cingulate cortex, blah, 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 blah. We don't really know. It became a standing joke. But the show we were working on was about brain science and gender, and that was intriguing because looking into it, I started to ask myself, why are people even looking in the brain for explanations for this stuff when the correlations between the layers, if you like, between observed differences and what happens in the brain and brain structure were so impossible to map, as it seems. And it seemed, looking back historically through the way gender differences have been seen, that this is just, and imposed quite largely, I think, from outside neuroscience, although we see some neuroscientists are doing it, but it is a way of naturalising what you observe in the world. So you observe that men and women still tend to do different jobs and behave in different ways. And having kind of gone, oh, well, we thought it was a social thing, but it doesn't seem to have gone away, then to try and go back and find a natural explanation and say, well, maybe our brain structures are different because, look, we're physically different, so maybe that makes sense. That it's almost a kind of trying to find a new and more scientific way to say, well, look, these differences are just natural, they're just innate, they haven't gone away, so perhaps we can find them in the brain, is just like the latest, most scientific, highest tech version of something that people have tried to do throughout history.
Thank you. The question is there no limit to what neuroscience can do? I wanted to ask about commercial exploitation of neuroscience. I'm thinking here about the field of neuroeconomics and what is being called neuromarketing, where effectively people can sell things better because they can find out what makes us want to save or spend or invest. And what are the panel's ideas on that?
Yeah, my question is really whether the pressure to find funding these days in terms of showing results and application in terms of public policy, whether that is distorting anything that you do in terms of your research in neurosciences, pushing you in directions that, limit the research that you would like to do if, in terms of pure knowledge rather than application.
It is actually, just on that point, it is actually true that when I was asked to be involved in a debate at the Dana Centre with some neuroscientists, that it kind of came up that some of the press release phenomena was overclaiming a little or rather they didn't mind that everybody thought they were being hugely successful because it might lead to better funding applications and show an impact. And that also that, and I do think this is true, that people who've worked maybe in neuroscience for a very long time and it not been taken any notice of, are suddenly the flavour of the month. It might be tempting to not keep saying we don't know anything, by the way, and we don't know as much as you think we know, and everybody wants to know us now, but no, don't know us because we don't know anything. You can see why it might be attractive to go, of course, we're the most important people in the world.
My question, probably from naivety, but I want to ask it anyway, is evidence base and the uncertainty principle. So let's say you have what stage of the evolution of the brain are you starting to look at it? So let's see how it maps out and makes new connections, maybe very different at an early age than it is at a higher age. So what can you say is evidence? Depending on you haven't looked at the full journey. It's a bit like you know where all the water's going to go if there's a flood, but you can't, individual molecules may be going backwards because they're snagged on trees and things.
I've got a lot of sympathy with the idea that the kind of broad political, cultural climate in which perhaps we have a diminished sense of the self and less confidence about free will and so forth, shapes very much how we view the science or perhaps how we misinterpret neuroscience or over-egg the claim, the kind of things it can tell us. But a straightforward question, does neuroscience, for what it doesn't know, does it or should it prompt us to reevaluate how we understand selfhood and free will and so forth? Does it tell us anything about that? Because it seems perhaps far-fetched to say that we shouldn't take any account of it.
I was originally, when we first started this debate, which I have to say I think has been absolutely brilliant, I thought of that West Side Story song. Do you remember Officer Krupke? We're down on our knees because no one wants a fellow with a social disease. And so that's the idea of pathologising things. But what's really interesting to me as a complete layperson and a non-scientist was this morning I was reading in a Scientific American about the crackling. The journalist described crackling activity in children's brains when they are being read to. And the debate was about the use of the printed page and the e-reader. And that image of that little girl on YouTube, that little 2-year-old, flicking, irritatingly, the page of a magazine because she couldn't tap it in the way that she was used to with an iPad. I don't know if anybody's seen that. Yeah. But the evidence of the brain activity responding to the shape of the page, the sound that it makes, the idea of a narrative of a text, being able to follow, I found that absolutely enthralling. And so the engagement of that sort of scientific information for somebody like me who rarely does read the Scientific American is exciting in the same way that Susan Greenfield's work, and I know it's very contentious, about the damages that we're doing or are perhaps happening to the way. And I suppose what occurs to me during this debate is not how much it is telling us about future behaviours, but actually it's warning us of the damaging things that might be happening. I don't want to be, but to at least act as a warning for us of the way things are changing, rather than what is motivating us to behave as we do.
But I think that's actually a really good example of where I suppose I come into this discussion, because we've just organised 2 battle satellites on the future of the book in battle, and e-readers and all that sort of thing, and in Athens and in Lisbon. And everybody starts saying there's evidence of, there's neuroscientific evidence of what happens when you turn a page over as to what you... And all he wanted to say was people have lost confidence in the power of literature as a transform, and that's why we've got a big plenary at the end of this festival called On Great Books. It's almost like people say, I don't understand why nobody's reading great books. One of the problems is that most teachers haven't got the confidence to stand in front of a class and say, read great books, they're better than rubbish books. Read them and they will change your lives. And then everyone has this oh, I don't know what's gone wrong, and then looks to the science. And you do think, have an argument, try and persuade someone before you assume it's something else.
And it's important to say the science can't answer the question, what makes a good book? There isn't a way of answering that question with neuroscience.
This was the mechanism. It was the mechanism of reading that was important.
No, I know.
It can certainly answer the question, what is the mechanism of reading? But the question is that helpful in any way in determining what makes a great book? I'm not sure.
Yes, but the point is that when people say, oh, that's why people aren't reading because of all this... Anyway, you get this.
I want to get back to insisting on levels of analysis, because it's not just the big question of the distinction between looking at the brain as a biological phenomenon, which is what neuroscience studies, and the mind, but also the individual and society. And I think it's really at that interaction that a lot of this is really nonsensical. Neuroscience, as far as I'm concerned, can explain a great deal at the level of the individual, particularly in relation to pathology. What's going wrong in the brain? Is it neurotransmitter problems? Is there an epileptic focus in the brain? Is there a plaque? In exactly the way that Sally outlined. It can tell us a great deal about the individual. It can tell us very, very little about the social mind. You know, our consciousness as humans has developed enormously over time. And that has been because our consciousness has developed primarily as a social phenomenon, which has then changed minds. And there is no way that neuroscience at the moment, at this level, can in any way possibly, I don't believe, talk about social consciousness and the influence of social policy on human behaviour.
Well, actually, there's quite a lot of work in that area in the last few years where people have become interested, because neuroscience isn't just about biological phenomena. The area I work in, cognitive neuroscience, is particularly interested in psychology as well, and it's interested in social behaviours as well. And while it's a small part of a very large field, there are a lot of people who are interested in just those questions. That's not to say that will explain those phenomena, but people are interested in understanding those phenomena.
I think that's what we're worried about. No, but isn't that the thing is that social phenomena, human-made social phenomena, then gets understood through a different prism. I think that was the... Yeah.
Just picking up from Professor Rees's, he made a point which quite a few people ran with, idea of levels of analysis and the fact that these are integrated. And of course, this is mirrored in how, through evolution, you get layers of biology on top of the layers of biology. And it's all biology, including culture. It feeds back to reinforce the underlying biology. So the way you explain things is bottom up. It's not top down by introducing this age-old idea of a ghost in the machine, which relates back to what you were saying about free will. So what's been happening generally is been focused on one level of analysis, neuroscience, saying, well, that's deficient, therefore the whole idea of levels of analysis and how they're integrated is deficient, and we have to go to nonsense about free will and the ghost in the machine. We do not.
Thank you very much. Yes?
Hi, two quick questions, one for Geraint. I've been fascinated by this whole thing. Quick question, do you distinguish how from why people do things, particularly because you use the word why the whole time? Mm-hmm. Second question was picking up, Sally, on what you talked at the beginning about the dazzling, the images and the imagination. And I'm wondering what you think, any of you, on how the images get perpetuated. You look at a New Scientist front cover, and is it cogs? Is it an electron cloud? Is it... Do you sort of mean the images which get propagated of what is natural, the imaginative vision embedded in physical science, we might say?
So we've just talked quite a lot about the misuse of neuroscience by policy. I just wanted to give an example of where it's enriched policy quite a lot, actually, which is with the Gray-Mallon report a couple of years ago, which argued that we should focus on young people quite a lot when their brains are still malleable. And that's helped move the Department for Education's budget a lot, tens of millions of pounds into younger education, which is a good thing. So I just want to get your reflections on that.
Let me pick up the neuromarketing thing. I think, as I'd hate to quote Michael Winner, but he's right. And this is, calm down, it's just a commercial. I recently reviewed a book on neuromarketing. Virtually every technique described in it predated neuroscience, and all the brain scans were showing what was happening when people fell for these tricks we've always known about. The way the book was packaged and sold was completely old school. Even down to the photograph of the author, who is described as doctor, telling you about authority, smiling, showing he's reassuring, but also books in the background, showing he's learned. There's a lot of hype about neuromarketing. So on the one hand, there's hardly anything it's bringing which is really new and sneaky, but also we have a great guarantee against this, because imagine you're Apple, and imagine you come up with the sneakiest neuromarketing technique ever. It's a way of getting people to go and buy phones, and they don't even realise they're doing it because they're being cued by something like that. Well, eventually it's going to get out, and it will completely destroy your brand. It's as simple as that. So in a sense, I think we don't need to worry, because the greatest reason people have for not trying to be highly manipulative is that when it's found out, which it will be at some point, even the CIA secrets can get sort of spread out through a hacker, it will destroy the brand. So I have a great belief that actually we have very, very little to worry about neuromarketing, and most of the ways we're being manipulated have been going for a very, very long time, and we just need to educate ourselves about the methods, and we can do a lot.
Okay, thanks. Geraint.
My 1 minute. Agree with all that. Neuromarketing doesn't work in general. So 3 things. How and why do I distinguish them? Yes, I do. Malleability and levels. I think one interesting thing that we haven't really picked up on at all is our brains are always malleable. So one way I think about it is our brains are, as it were, in dialogue with our other brains around us and the environment. After all, if synaptic plasticity doesn't happen in your brains right now, then you're leaving here and you'll have no memory of what went on and nothing happening. So our brains are changing all the time, and it's a misnomer to say that children's brains are changing and ours are not. That's not correct. Finally, funders, just to answer that question, do funders push us in a certain direction? No, not individually. The Wellcome Trust have been quite happy to fund my Blue Skies research for a decade and have just given me quite a large sum of money, thank you very much, to carry on doing that for the next 5 years. Do we collectively do that? Well, yes. As a university where I work and where I'm Deputy Head of Faculty for Brain Sciences, we're passionate about transforming society through generation and application of knowledge. And so at a portfolio level, we do want to have an impact, hopefully positive, on society and on the problems that we think are most important. So yes, we are, but that's collective and that's a portfolio approach rather than pressuring any individual within that multidisciplinary environment.
Thanks Geraint. Bill?
Well, I guess I should start off with just a caveat saying I actually studied physics as an undergraduate. I'm certainly not anti-science. I'm just cautious when I see a new branch of science migrating so rapidly into so many social policy agendas that maybe some scientists are marginally naive in what's going to come next in relation to that. And I'm just urging a degree of caution and maybe restraint. There's a standard chessboard, there's 10 to the power 120 different games of chess. At a few million a second, it's going to take you 10 to the 90 years to complete them all. The universe is only 14 billion years old. A game of chess is far more simple than your brain. I just think there are absolute limits to what neuroscience will be able to tell us. And if you really want to understand why do people do what they do, don't study neuroscience.
Thank you very much. Sally?
I'll close by saying that we've had, in behavior, we've had a lot of supposedly unifying theories of human behavior. And just starting with Freud, then we went to behaviorism, then sociobiology, then the genetic explosion. And now it looks as if neuroscience may or may not be poised to be the next in that series of well, it's not a movement, thank goodness, but the next field of inquiry that's being put forward by some people, and certainly not Dr. Rees, who seems eminently balanced, but by others who are much more zealous and trying to put it forward in terms of its having universal explanatory power. It does not. We've learned a lot. I would even say we've learned from Freud, happen to be sympathetic, but we've certainly, oh my gosh, of course, with genes, and we've learned so much from evolutionary psychology, and we've learned so much from behaviorism. We use this every day in policy, and with respect to neurobiology, I'll be surprised if it does influence policy. It might, we'll see, but nevertheless, like the others, it's certainly going to break our hearts in terms of being able to explain human action on a broad scale.
Thank you very much. What a brilliant panel.